Well, let's talk about what you primarily came here to talk about, SCAN. So what time did you start getting involved?
Okay, I first became aware of SCAN because I was looking for a job. And it was actually the first job, I was looking for a job after having been out of the workforce for 2 years, first living in England for 2 years, where my first son was born, and then coming back into this country, and 4 months later my younger son was born. So I had been out of the workforce for about 4 years. And I was starting to look for a job, and the market was not great. And it was also, there's a certain amount of lack of, I mean, you've been out of the workforce, it's like, who's going to hire me? Mm-hmm. I've been, so what have you been doing for the last 4 years? Well, I've been diapering babies. Not much else. And parenting. But it's a little intimidating when you first start doing that. So I had been applying, and it was also the time of year, it was sort of January, and so that's not a huge time for people to hire anyway. But I saw this in the newspaper, because in those days, that's where you went to look for a job, because everything was still hard copy. It was, want ads were in the newspaper, and they're really, I don't think, that would have been 2000, that would have been 1992, January of 92. I don't think anything was electronic at that point. It's kind of hard to remember, but I don't think so in terms of public media. Or if it was very low-key and small. So looking at the newspaper and saw that, and so I sent in my application, and then this being a very small valley, the gentleman who was then chair of the board had been a Dickinson student, and actually had been a student of my husband's, and had been very involved with student stuff when I was working for Dickinson, so I had met him then. His name was Jim Cartmel, and I'm guessing Jim graduated maybe like 89, 88, somewhere in there. I'm not sure exactly. And he was working for maybe Capital Blue Cross, somebody big, health insurance, I think. So that was sort of welcoming and like, yeah. Whoa. And so after a series of interviews with the executive director and then with the board, they hired me. And I was just absolutely elated. I was also, I don't know if I was the most naive person on the planet at that point, but I was one of the most naive people on the planet when it came to homophobia, because it never occurred to me that this would be an issue. These are, SCAN was taking care of people who were sick. Mm-hmm. Cancer Society, Heart Association, leukemia and lymphoma. I mean, it's somebody sick, you figure out a way to take care of them. So then I called my parents and my mother-in-law to tell them about my new job, and I was very excited. And my mother had the A answer, and she said, whatever makes you happy makes me happy. It's like, okay, not overwhelming, but that's okay. And then I was talking to my dad, and his comment was, I never thought you'd work at a place like that. Not a great answer. Then I told my mother-in-law, and her comment was, don't bring anything home. The C answer, or perhaps the F answer. I was almost in tears by the time I got through telling them. And this was what I didn't know at the time was this was the first reaction that was going to become more common. And more often than not, when I told people other than my close friends about the job that I had taken, they were like, why are you working there? And it's like, well, because they'll pay me. That seems like a really good plan. And it's a nonprofit, and I wanted to work for a nonprofit. And I liked the people I'd met, because they were delightful. It took several months before I realized sort of what I had done, which was being and the other thing that sort of brought this to mind, I'd say I was at SCAN for about a week when one of our volunteers popped his head into my office, and he asked me the same question. He's like, why are you working here? And I looked at him and I said, because they pay me. And he was like, okay, that's fine. And my sense was that what he was trying to find out was whether or not I was your basic suburban white woman, bleeding heart liberal who had come here to take care of the innocent victims. but without saying that. Though that came up later with other things. But it became clear really early on that I had completely and utterly underestimated the level of homophobia and fear that people had about gay people, drug users, HIV, AIDS. Sort of, is it catching? Is it in the air? Can you shake hands with somebody and get it? Whatever, sort of what kind of contact? I mean, most people were so stunningly ignorant, including myself, about sort of transmission. What is this really? How does this affect people? We just didn't know, and we were all on a massive learning curve along with the NIH and everybody else because people didn't know anything. They didn't know how to treat it. They didn't know how to do things with it. So it was a kind of a crazy transition over time. It got to the point that I would regularly meet people in business situations where they would not shake my hand, where they would move away from me and like literally, physically sort of move back from me. I can still remember going to a training session that was being put on by one of the nonprofits in the area about fundraising, and it was free. So my executive director at that time, Peg Durkers, and Jim Cartmel, who was our board chair, and I all went to see, because it was also a way to meet funders as well. So we thought that would be useful. And Jim had a cold. So he was a little sneezy, coughing. And people, no one would sit near him. No one would shake his hand. No one would talk to him. People physically moved away from him when he coughed or sneezed. Like somehow, I mean, we used to tease in the office that there were AIDS cooties and, what was going to happen if somebody was going to catch them from us. But it was, and we could laugh about it, but it was actually really serious. I mean, the level of disconnect between the general public and anybody working in the area was massive. And talking to reporters, they didn't know what the hell they were talking about and would ask monumentally stupid questions about everything. And there was a huge amount of, I don't know if it was really misinformation or just complete ignorance that had an impact on everyone because they just didn't know. So I was hired as the first development person. Before that, everything had been volunteers. And the organization originally had been all volunteers. And so Peg was the first executive director, and there were caseworkers, and SCAN was also the home of the Pennsylvania AIDS Hotline. So that person lived in our office as well, even though she wasn't on our payroll, she was on the state's payroll. That's where she was there when we were there. I'm trying to think, was that everybody? Oh, we had an education person as well. Who was mainly doing street outreach to people, trying to get people to come in and talk to us, people to seek out services. She had hoped to be able to start a clean needle program, but needle exchange was anathema at that point. So handing out a lot of condoms, handing out a lot of booklets, information, that kind of thing. And she had a group of volunteers who did street work with her as well. So we were a pretty small group. So I'm guessing, I'd have to go back and think, but I think there were 4 caseworkers, the hotline person, the education person, me, Peg, a receptionist, and a part-time bookkeeper. And I think that was everybody. And then we had a bootload of volunteers, many of whom would come in and out at odd times because some of them were on disability, so they weren't working, so they would come in and stuff envelopes and make photocopies and get the street packets ready for people, which were little plastic bags, little Ziploc bags, and there was like a condom, a sterile wipe, what else was in there? Lube. Seems to me there was something else in there as well, and maybe a booklet of some kind, so that because we handed out hundreds of these things to people. I mean, I didn't, but the street folks, those folks did. And other than that, I mean, during the day, we basically operated as any nonprofit operated. The caseworkers were seeing clients. I was mainly in charge of the AIDS Walk, organizing the AIDS Walk. And then we had another, that was in the fall. And then, is that right? Or is it in the spring? I can't even remember now. No, it must have been the fall, because spring we had something called Caring a la carte, which was a dining program where restaurants would agree to give X% of the profit to the organization, and people would host tables. So like I would recruit a group of people to come to a particular restaurant with me, and we'd all sit together, and then that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But there were very few restaurants who were willing to talk to us. And in fact, several years later, when I moved on to my next job, one of the first things I realized was that people returned my phone calls when I worked for a community college much faster than when I worked for SCAN. So it was just a crazy time. And of course, it was also, I was working there before the triple cocktail came out. So there was pretty much AZT, and there was another DD something. I can't remember what the other med was. But it meant that people were dying. And some people died very fast. Some people, it was a much longer trajectory. Some people lived long enough so that by the time the triple cocktail came, they got their lives back. But we literally watched people disappear because they would get smaller and smaller and thinner. And then all of a sudden they wouldn't be coming in anymore because they couldn't get out of bed or because they had died. And it was, I don't know how the caseworkers did it, to be honest with you, because they became very close to the clients. The folks I knew were the folks who were our volunteers. So that was a subset of the group of people that were being served by the organization. But in the 2 months before I changed jobs, I went to 4 funerals. And I got to the point that and I think all of us did, that you'd walk down the street, you'd be sitting in a restaurant, you'd come into a library, and you'd look at somebody and you'd be like, they're dying. Because it was so common to us. I mean, you'd look at somebody and they'd have all the classic wasting syndrome kind of symptoms and everything else. And now, they might not have been dying of AIDS, they could have been dying of cancer, but it was like there was this look that people got when things were starting to go pear-shaped. And you saw it everywhere because there was nothing to stop the disease or slow it down. But AZT also had incredible side effects for people as well, so it was very harsh. And when the triple cocktail first came out, if I remember correctly, it was only effective for there was 35% of people could not take it. And there was a man who almost was the second executive director of SCAN, who was a doc at Hershey, who had been outed and then fired for being both gay and HIV positive. And sued Hershey, and eventually he was known as Dr. X. And Mark was a wonderful man, but he was one of the people that the cocktail didn't work, and I think he died in 95 or 96. But it was a crazy sort of existence because sort of work was one thing, and the rest of my life was completely different. I had two toddlers. Paul was 4 and Sam was 2. So it was just kind of these two pieces of my life didn't really fit together very well. And I was also working crazy hours, so that probably didn't help either. But things were changing. I mean, even in that short period of time, because I worked for SCAN from, I think it was January of 1992 till May of 95. And even in that time period, things were really starting to change in terms of people's perceptions of the disease. Maybe it was because with the triple cocktail coming in, it meant that it wasn't quite as scary, even though that took a while to kind of all happen. But maybe it's also that just people were talking about it, people were being more open about this. And the other thing it meant that all sorts of people who had been deeply in the closet couldn't hide anymore. So it changed everything. And all of a sudden, people did know people who were gay. Some of them sick, some of them not sick, but partners of someone who was sick, or people who you'd always assumed were good friends, and all of a sudden be like, oh, they're partners. Because you just, if you're not looking for something, you don't see it. So it doesn't, and it was, of course, in the public discourse, it was also pretty much not there either. So there was nothing to reinforce the notion that homosexuality was everywhere. And of course, lesbians have also always been able to be more sort of, I don't know if hidden is right, maybe hidden is the right word, than it is for gay men, because people don't think twice about two women walking closely, talking to each other and, or having a dinner together. You don't even think about it, because best friends have done that forever. Or sisters, or cousins, or, whomever. But for men, it was much harder. And there were lots of people who came out, who were outed. I mean, that was also the period where people were outing other people. And it was cruel, because often that person wasn't ready to be public. So it was that was a huge deal when that happened. I'm trying to think of the actor's name. I'm blanking, but I mean, there were public people who suddenly got outed as gay as well, and for some of them, it ruined their careers. They were done.